stop whatever you're doing right now, because what just happened in the last few hours could literally change the entire map of the Middle East. The United States and Iran, two countries that have been exchanging military blows for over 30 days, have just agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. Iran's missiles were still flying toward Israel even as this ceasefire was being announced. American aircraft were on standby. President Trump had already issued a deadline for Iran to comply or face an escalation that military analysts said could have been catastrophic. And then Pakistan stepped in. Yes, Pakistan. And within hours, Trump was posting on Truth Social. Iran's state media was declaring victory, and Pakistan's prime minister was inviting both sides to Islamabad. In this video, I am going to break down everything. What happened, who said what each side is claiming, what the disagreements are, and most importantly, is this ceasefire real? Is it going to hold? Or are we about to watch it fall apart? Let's go. Before we get into the ceasefire itself, let's take 30 seconds to understand the situation that led to this moment. Because if you don't understand the backdrop, you won't understand why this deal is such a big deal. For over 30 days, the United States and Israel have been conducting a sustained military campaign against Iran. We're talking about roughly 700 strikes per day, targeting nuclear facilities, military infrastructure, ballistic missile production sites, naval assets, and air defense systems. Now that number, 700 strikes a day, is one that most people in the West haven't fully absorbed. And the reason is simple. Cameras are not allowed inside Iran, so the world hasn't seen the scale of destruction happening there. But senior defense analysts are now describing it as devastating. Iran's navy has been essentially destroyed. Its air force has been crippled. Its ballistic missile stockpiles, the very weapons it used to strike back, have been either destroyed or buried underground. Its ability to replenish those weapons has been heavily degraded. And yet, Iran pulled off something that neither the US nor Israel could fully solve. It maintained control over the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you don't know why the Strait of Hormuz matters, here's the quick version. About 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman. If that strait gets blocked or even disrupted, global oil markets go haywire, energy prices spike, and every economy on Earth feels it, especially the Gulf states that are US allies. Iran's ability to threaten, harass, and partially control maritime traffic in the Strait has been their single biggest strategic card in this conflict, and they played it well. That's why so much of the diplomatic language around this ceasefire revolves around the Strait. The US made the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz one of its core conditions. Iran, on the other hand, says it should have control over traffic in its own geographic backyard. That contradiction, right there, is the landmine sitting underneath this entire ceasefire agreement. But we'll get to that. So how did we get from Trump issuing bombing deadlines to Pakistan's PM announcing a ceasefire in the span of a few hours? Here's the sequence of events as best as we can reconstruct it. Trump had issued what was essentially an ultimatum to Iran: meet our conditions or face escalating military strikes. The deadline was set for around 3:30 a.m. Tehran time. People inside Iran were not sleeping. They were stocking up on food, buying candles, storing water, preparing for strikes on power plants, bridges, and roads. The fear was real, and it was widespread. Behind the scenes, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif had been working the phones, speaking with both Washington and Tehran, positioning Pakistan as a neutral mediator. Pakistan has a unique role here. It's a Muslim-majority nation with nuclear capability. It has historical ties to both the Islamic world and the US, and it has been one of the few countries with open lines of communication to all parties. According to Trump's own statement on Truth Social, the Pakistani Prime Minister proposed a deal. The key condition Trump attached to his agreement was this: Iran had to commit to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Trump wrote, and I want to read this carefully because the wording matters, that he agreed to suspend the bombing and attack of Iran for a period of 2 weeks, and that this would be a double-sided ceasefire. Notice the word suspend, not end, not stop, suspend. That's not accidental. That's Trump keeping the military option very visibly on the table while stepping back from the immediate brink. On the Iranian side, the Supreme National Security Council issued a statement saying that Iran had reached almost all of its objectives in this war. They said the enemy is facing a historic failure. They referenced a 10-point peace plan that they claim the United States has now accepted. And then Pakistan's PM, Shahbaz Sharif, posted on X, and this was the most formal diplomatic announcement of all. He said both nations, along with their allies, had agreed to an immediate ceasefire everywhere, including Lebanon, effective immediately. He then invited delegations from both sides to come to Islamabad on Friday, April 10th, 2026, to begin formal negotiations toward what he called a conclusive agreement to settle all disputes. That's the sequence. That's how we got here. But now comes the hard part, because when you actually look at what each side is claiming they agreed to, the gap is enormous. This is the part of the story that most news coverage is glossing over, and it's the most important part. Both sides say there's a ceasefire. Both sides say talks are happening, but when you look at the specifics of what each side says was agreed to, the differences are stark. Let's go through Iran's 10-point peace plan, because this is what Iranian state media is claiming the US has accepted. Point 1, a complete and permanent end to the war. Point 2, reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, but crucially, with Iran having control over maritime traffic. Point 3, compensation and reconstruction payments to Iran. Point 4, full and complete lifting of all sanctions on Iran. Point 5, Iran commits to not seeking nuclear weapons, plus additional points that include the US withdrawing all military bases from the region, and a total ceasefire covering all of Iran's proxy conflicts, meaning Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza, and elsewhere. Now, let's look at what the United States has said publicly. The US says it agreed to a ceasefire conditional on the free and open flow of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. has stated, firmly and repeatedly, that it will not accept uranium enrichment continuing inside Iran. The U.S. has said nothing publicly about sanctions relief, compensation payments, or withdrawing military bases from the region. So what you have here is Iran saying, the U.S. accepted our 10-point plan, and the U.S. saying, we agreed to a ceasefire so long as the Strait stays open. These are not the same thing. These are not even close to the same thing. Iran is describing this as a near-total diplomatic victory. The U.S. is describing it as a temporary tactical pause with conditions attached. Kashayar Janeti, the BBC Persian-Washington correspondent, put it very bluntly, the upcoming talks are going to be extremely difficult, and the trust deficit between both sides is enormous. And Colonel Mark Kansian from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a senior defense advisor, said something even more striking. He described finding common ground between these two positions as essentially impossible. Let that sink in. A senior U.S. defense analyst is saying that a lasting agreement between these two sides is essentially impossible. And yet, the ceasefire just got announced. So what's actually going on here? Here's the thing about ceasefires and complicated conflicts. They almost always happen not because both sides want the same thing, but because both sides need a break for very different reasons. And this ceasefire is a perfect example of that. Let's start with Iran. Iran is in a genuinely terrible position right now, despite all the victorious language coming out of state media. Its military has taken catastrophic damage. Its economy was already in shambles before this war, and 30-plus days of sustained bombardment have made it significantly worse. The regime is simultaneously trying to fight a war externally while maintaining an iron grip on a population that, in significant numbers, opposes the government. In January, there were major protests inside Iran. The regime responded with mass arrests, and in the days just before this ceasefire, the government had been executing arrested protesters, 1 or 2 executions per day. That is a government under serious internal pressure trying to project strength while desperately needing relief from external pressure. The fear of strikes on power plants, bridges, and roads was real, and it was felt by ordinary Iranians, not just the regime. People were awake at 1:30 in the morning waiting for bombs to fall. A ceasefire, even an imperfect one, gives the regime breathing room. It lets them declare victory to their own population. It lets them say, we survived. We stood up to America and Israel for 30 days and we're still here. Is that a real victory? Militarily, not really. But politically, for a regime fighting for its survival, that narrative matters enormously. Now let's look at the US. President Trump, and this is something multiple analysts have pointed out, has never been a president who wants to get stuck in a Middle Eastern war. He ran on ending wars, not starting them. The conflict with Iran began under specific circumstances, but sustaining it indefinitely has political and economic costs. The Strait of Hormuz situation in particular has been a constant frustration. The US has the firepower to bomb Iran into rubble, but it hasn't been able to solve the Strait problem through military means alone. And Trump is very aware that a deal, any deal, even an imperfect one, plays better domestically than an open-ended military campaign with no defined endpoint. So both sides wanted a ceasefire, but for completely different reasons, and with completely different expectations of what that ceasefire will lead to. That's a recipe for a very turbulent 2 weeks in Islamabad. Let's spend a moment on the Strait of Hormuz, because you cannot understand this conflict or this ceasefire without understanding why this body of water is so important. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway, at its narrowest point, only about 33 kilometers wide, that sits between Iran to the north and Oman, and the UAE to the south. It connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, and through it flows approximately 20 to 21 million barrels of oil per day. roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply. Saudi Arabia exports through it. Kuwait exports through it. The UAE exports through it. Iraq exports through it. Qatar ships its liquefied natural gas through it. If you disrupt the Strait of Hormuz, you don't just hurt one country, you send shockwaves through the entire global economy. Iran sits on the northern shore of the strait. It has missiles, submarines, fast attack boats, and anti-ship capabilities positioned along that coastline. This geographic reality gives Iran an asymmetric advantage that no amount of American air power has been able to fully neutralize. You can bomb Iran's military, and the US and Israel have done exactly that on a massive scale. But as long as Iran retains even a degraded ability to harass shipping in the strait, it retains leverage. That leverage is why this war has been so frustrating for the United States. Militarily, the US is winning overwhelmingly. Strategically, Iran is not losing the thing that matters most to it, the ability to be a thorn in the side of global energy markets. Now, the ceasefire conditions include something about the Strait. Trump says Iran agreed to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait. Iran says it should have control over maritime traffic through the Strait because of its geographic position. These two positions are in direct conflict, and they will be the central issue at the Islamabad negotiations. If Iran agrees to fully open the Strait with no strings attached, it gives up its single most powerful piece of leverage. Why would it do that? On the other hand, if the US allows Iran to retain control of maritime traffic through the Strait, that's a massive strategic concession that American allies in the Gulf will be furious about. There is no easy middle ground here. This is the knot that negotiators in Islamabad will have to try to untangle. And then there's the nuclear issue, because of course there is. Iran's nuclear program has been a source of international tension for decades. The fear shared by the US, Israel, and most Western nations is that Iran is pursuing the capability to build nuclear weapons, even if it hasn't officially declared that intent. One of the conditions that the US insisted on as part of this ceasefire and any future deal was that Iran commit to not seeking nuclear weapons. And to be fair, Iran's 10-point plan does include a commitment to not pursuing nuclear weapons. But here's where it gets complicated. Enrichment. The US has said clearly and firmly that it does not want Iran enriching uranium inside Iran at all. Zero enrichment. No domestic nuclear enrichment program. Iran's state media, on the other hand, is claiming that as part of the ceasefire understanding, the US has agreed to allow Iran to continue enriching uranium inside the country. Once again, these two positions are completely opposite. The US says no enrichment. Iran says the US agreed to enrichment. And both sides are claiming this publicly. Either one of them is misrepresenting what was agreed to, or more likely, both sides deliberately left this point vague so that a ceasefire could be announced with the intention of fighting about it for the next 2 weeks in Islamabad. That kind of deliberate ambiguity is actually a common diplomatic technique. You announce the agreement first, then argue about what it means later. It's not ideal, but it's how diplomacy often works when the alternative is continued bombing. The nuclear question, specifically the enrichment question, is one that has derailed US-Iran negotiations multiple times in the past. There is no reason to believe it will be easier this time. Now let's talk about something that I think is genuinely fascinating about this whole situation: the role of Pakistan. Pakistan has positioned itself as the key mediator in this crisis. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif is the one who proposed the ceasefire deal to Trump. Pakistan is hosting the upcoming talks in Islamabad, and Pakistan is the country that both sides, the US and Iran, apparently trust enough to serve as an honest broker. That is a significant moment for Pakistan on the world stage. Think about Pakistan's position. It's a Muslim-majority country with nuclear weapons. It has a complicated relationship with the United States, historically an ally, but with deep tensions. It has close economic ties with China. It has maintained diplomatic relations with Iran, and it is geographically positioned in a region that is deeply affected by everything happening in the Persian Gulf. For Pakistan to step into this role, and for both Washington and Tehran to accept it, says something about how serious the situation got. When you're at the point of needing a neutral Muslim-majority nuclear power to mediate between you, the stakes are extremely high. It also represents a kind of diplomatic coming of age for Pakistan under Shahbaz Sharif. Whatever happens next, Pakistan has demonstrated that it has a role to play in major international crises. That changes how the world looks at Islamabad in ways that could have long-term implications for Pakistan's foreign policy standing. The talks are scheduled to begin in Islamabad on Friday, April 10th. The ceasefire is set for 2 weeks. That means negotiators have until roughly April 22nd before the question of extension or breakdown arises. 2 weeks is not a lot of time to resolve issues that have been unresolved for decades. Now, I want to address something that happened immediately after the ceasefire was announced, because it tells you something important about the fragility of this moment. Even as the ceasefire announcement was being broadcast, Israel was reporting a barrage of incoming Iranian missiles. The skies over Tel Aviv were tracked. Teams in Jerusalem reported loud explosions. Reports emerged that U.S. officials believed it could take a while for Iranian armed forces to even receive the message to stand down. Read that again. Iranian forces might not even know there's a ceasefire yet. That is how rapidly this situation evolved. The announcement outpaced the operational reality on the ground. Missiles were still in the air when diplomats were already declaring peace. That is a deeply unstable situation, and it's a reminder that in conflicts of this complexity, involving multiple proxy forces, multiple command structures, multiple factions within the Iranian military, a ceasefire isn't a switch you flip. It's a process, and that process can break down very quickly. There are several scenarios that could derail the Islamabad talks and collapse the ceasefire. First, a miscalculation on the ground. A stray missile, an accidental engagement, a provocation by a proxy group that doesn't get the memo. Any of these could escalate before diplomats have time to respond. Second, the domestic politics of the Iranian regime. Remember, this is a government that just survived a war but is facing internal unrest. It may find it politically useful to show toughness during negotiations, or it may face hardliners within the system who don't want to deal at any price. Third, the Israel factor. Israel is not a passive actor here. It has its own security calculations, its own red lines, and its own timeline. If Israel determines that the ceasefire is giving Iran time to rearm or reconstitute its capabilities, it may act unilaterally, which would blow up the talks entirely. Fourth, the trust deficit. Iran and the U.S. have negotiated twice in the past year. Both times, in the middle of negotiations, a war started. That history does not make either side confident in the other's intentions. The Supreme National Security Council of Iran acknowledged this trust deficit even in its own statement announcing the ceasefire. Let's zoom out for a moment and think about the bigger picture, because this ceasefire, whatever its flaws and ambiguities, is a genuinely historic moment. For the first time in decades, the United States and Iran have been in direct, sustained military conflict. Not proxy conflict, not covert operations, not sanctions and counter-sanctions, actual direct military exchange. And now, 30-plus days in, both sides have stepped back from the brink. That matters, even if the talks fail, even if the ceasefire collapses in 2 weeks. The fact that both sides found a way to de-escalate, through Pakistani mediation, through diplomatic back channels, through a carefully worded social media post from a U.S. president, tells us something important about the limits of military power. The United States has enormous military superiority. It has demonstrated that clearly over the past month. And yet military superiority alone could not solve the strategic problem posed by the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, for all its devastation, retained enough asymmetric capability to make the U.S.'s military dominance feel incomplete. That forced a diplomatic solution, and that's actually how most conflicts end. Not with a decisive military victory, but with a negotiated arrangement that both sides can live with, even if neither side is fully satisfied. The question now is whether the diplomats in Islamabad can build something durable on the fragile foundation of this 2-week ceasefire. The issues on the table are enormous. The Strait, the nuclear program, sanctions, compensation, proxy conflicts across the region. Resolving all of those in 2 weeks would be extraordinary. In fact, most analysts don't expect a comprehensive deal in 2 weeks. What's more realistic is that the 2 weeks lead to an extended ceasefire, kicking the can down the road while the harder negotiations continue. And that might actually be the best realistic outcome. Not a final deal, but a managed de-escalation that prevents the worst-case scenario from happening. Colonel Kansian from CSIS made an interesting point. It's possible that President Trump decides that what has already been achieved, significant damage to Iran's nuclear program, destruction of its navy and air force, degradation of its missile capabilities, is good enough. That a frozen conflict, where Iran is weakened and contained, might be more achievable and more sustainable than a comprehensive peace deal. That's a sobering thought, but it's probably the most likely near-term outcome. So what should you be watching for in the coming days and weeks? Here are the key things to track closely. Number 1, does the ceasefire actually hold on the ground? We already saw missiles flying after the announcement. Watch whether both sides enforce a real halt to hostilities, or whether there are ongoing violations that threaten to unravel the whole thing before talks even begin. Number 2, who shows up in Islamabad on Friday? The level title of the delegation sent by both sides will tell you how seriously each country is taking these talks. If the US sends senior officials and Iran sends mid-level diplomats, that tells you something. If both sides send heavyweight negotiators, that's a positive sign. Number 3, is there any joint statement on the Strait of Hormuz? This is the core issue. Any agreed language on the Strait, even vague language, would represent significant progress. Number 4, what happens with the nuclear enrichment question? Watch for whether either side makes any public concession on this, or whether they just continue stating incompatible positions publicly while negotiating privately behind closed doors. Number 5, what is Israel doing? Israel is not a party to these talks, but it is deeply affected by them. Watch Israeli government statements and any Israeli military activity during the ceasefire period. One unilateral Israeli strike could blow up the entire diplomatic process. Number 6, what is the reaction inside Iran? The regime is portraying this as a great victory. How long can they sustain that narrative? If ordinary Iranians begin to feel that their suffering has produced nothing concrete, no sanctions relief, no reconstruction money, continued economic pain, that internal pressure could affect the regime's negotiating posture. Number 7, watch Trump's domestic political situation. He needs a win. He needs to be able to come out of this and say he ended a war, or at least achieved something significant. That pressure could push him toward accepting a deal that more hawkish advisors in his administration would oppose. Watch for signs of internal disagreement on the US side. They will inevitably surface. Before I wrap up, I want to take a moment to talk about something that can get lost in all the geopolitical analysis and diplomatic maneuvering. The human cost of what's happened over the past 30+ days. Think about the people inside Iran who were awake at 1:30 in the morning, waiting for bombs to fall on their power plants, who had been stockpiling food and candles and water because they were afraid the lights would go out and not come back on, who have been living through economic collapse, political repression, military bombardment, and the grief of whatever casualties this conflict has produced inside Iran, numbers that the world still doesn't fully know because cameras aren't allowed in. Think about the people in the Gulf states, in Israel, in Lebanon, in Yemen, who have been caught up in a conflict that began with decisions made in Washington and Tehran and has played out across an entire region. Think about the protesters inside Iran who were arrested in January and are now facing execution. People who wanted political change and instead got war and a regime that is using the emergency of conflict to harden its grip on power even further. Whatever happens in Islamabad, whatever deal gets made or doesn't get made, there are human beings on all sides of this conflict who have suffered enormously. And a ceasefire, even an imperfect, ambiguous, fragile ceasefire, means people get to breathe. Power plants don't get bombed tonight. Families don't go to sleep terrified. That matters. That's worth saying out loud, even in the middle of all the strategic analysis. All right, let's bring this all together. Here's what we know for sure. The United States and Iran have agreed to a 2-week ceasefire, brokered by Pakistan's Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif. Formal negotiations are set to begin in Islamabad on Friday, April 10th. Both sides are framing the ceasefire on very different terms. The US says it's about keeping the Strait open. Iran says it achieved most of its war objectives. The key issues, the Strait of Hormuz, nuclear enrichment, sanctions, compensation, proxy conflicts, are nowhere near resolved. They are, in fact, the core of what Islamabad negotiations will need to tackle. The ceasefire was already showing cracks within hours, with Iranian missiles continuing to strike toward Israel even after the announcement. And independent analysts describe the prospects for a comprehensive lasting deal as, in their own words, essentially impossible. And yet, here we are. 30 days of war, and both sides step back from the brink. That's not nothing. In a region that has seen conflict upon conflict, every day without active bombardment is a day that people get to breathe. It's a day that the world doesn't spiral further into an energy crisis or a wider regional war. What comes next depends on whether the diplomats in Islamabad can find language that both sides can claim as a victory. It depends on whether the ceasefire holds long enough for real negotiations to take root. And it depends on whether Trump decides that a frozen, managed situation is good enough, or whether he pushes for something more ambitious. We will be covering every development on this channel as it happens. If you want to stay updated on the most in-depth, no-nonsense analysis of this story, hit the subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. This story is far from over, and we will bring you the analysis you need to actually understand what's happening, not just what people are saying. If you found this breakdown useful, please like the video. It genuinely helps get this kind of serious, detailed content in front of more people who need it. And drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think this ceasefire will hold? Do you think the Islamabad talks will produce a real deal? Or will they collapse in 2 weeks? I want to hear what you think. I'll see you in the next one.